Outdated human ship wipes out entire fleet. Alien commander stunned. Nobody at the Dravki Fleet Command had bothered to look up the ship's name before they surrounded it. That was their first mistake. The second mistake was assuming that because the ship was old, the people inside it were afraid. The Varen Passage had been quiet for 11 years. Trade routes had opened around it, better routes with cleaner jumps and fewer complications, and so the passage had slowly emptied out until the only vessels still using it were the ones that could not afford to go the long way. Cargo runners, independent haulers, occasionally a medical ship cutting time off a critical delivery. The kind of traffic that nobody powerful cared about, which made it the perfect place for someone powerful to plant a flag without much resistance. The Dravki Territorial Authority had planted their flag 3 weeks ago. Nobody in the Galactic Council had done anything about it, yet because nobody in the Galactic Council moved fast about anything, and because the vessels being turned back and searched and delayed were small vessels operated by people with no political weight to throw around. Then the UHS Resolute came through. It had not come looking for a fight. That part was important, and the part that most of the later accounts would get wrong. The Resolute was carrying water filtration equipment, 43 crates of it, bound for a Yithrani colony on the far side of the passage that had been running on compromised water for 2 months. Hara Osa had taken the contract because it paid well, and because it was the kind of contract she preferred, the ones where the cargo mattered. She had not been told about the Dravki blockade, because the last ship to attempt the passage had been turned back 12 days ago, and nobody had thought to update the independent hauler's route advisory in the meantime. She found out about the blockade the same way she found out about most things. It appeared on her scan screen without warning, and she looked at it for a moment, and then decided what she was going to do about it. What she decided was that she was going to keep going. The Resolute was 44 years old. It had been a warship once, a real one, built and commissioned and sent to fight during the First Contact War, and it had fought, and it had survived, which not all ships from that era could say. After the war, it had been decommissioned and sold, and passed through 4 owners in 20 years before Hara had bought it from a salvage lot on the edge of Mevari Station for a price that had seemed too low, and had turned out to be exactly right because the ship needed almost everything fixed, and she had spent the next 3 years fixing it. She had not fixed it back to what it had been when it was new. She had fixed it into something different, something that worked the way she needed it to work, which was not always the way the original engineers had intended. That distinction was going to matter very much in the next few hours. The Dravki commander who had been assigned to the passage blockade was a fleet officer named Gret. He was experienced and organized and completely certain of how this was going to go. He had turned back 31 vessels in 12 days. None of them had resisted in any meaningful way because none of them had any meaningful way to resist. The Dravki fleet in the passage consisted of 9 warships, all modern, all well-maintained, and all crewed by people who were good at their jobs. When Gret's scan officer put the Resolute on screen, he looked at it for about 4 seconds. He told his communications officer to hail the vessel and inform it that the passage was under territorial authority jurisdiction, and that it was required to hold position, submit to inspection, and await a decision on whether it would be permitted to proceed. His communications officer sent the message. The response came back in under 1 minute. The voice on the other end was a woman's voice, unhurried, and she said that the Resolute was operating under humanitarian cargo exemption as defined in the Varen Accord, that her manifest was filed and available for review, and that she would be proceeding on her current heading. Gret looked at his communications officer. His communications officer looked back at him. He had received polite refusals before, usually from vessel captains who felt they needed to make a statement before ultimately complying. He sent back a second message explaining that the humanitarian exemption had been suspended pending review under the reclassification provision. The voice came back again, same unhurried tone. It said the exemption predated the provision by 60 years and was not subject to suspension by a subordinate authority action. Gret asked his legal officer as a formality whether this was correct. His legal officer took 40 seconds and then said, quietly, that it was technically correct. Gret looked at the scan screen again. One old ship, minimal visible weapon mounts, a crew registry that listed 26 people. He made a decision that was based entirely on the assumption that technical correctness and actual power were not the same thing. He told his weapons officer to put a targeting lock on the human vessel. Not to fire, just to make the point clearly. On the Resolute's bridge, a young crew member named Sudi watched the targeting lock signal appear on the threat board and turned to Hara with wide eyes. Hara was reading something on her personal screen and did not look up immediately. When she did, she glanced at the threat board, then at Sudi, and said that it was fine and that Sudi should go tell Rafe that they had guests. Sudi went. Hara looked back at her screen. She was reading the Varen Accord, not because she did not already know what it said. She knew exactly what it said. She had read it many times over many years in many different corridors. She was reading it because she wanted to be sure she had not missed anything new. She had not missed anything new. She set the screen down and told Pella to hold current heading and current speed. Outside, 9 Dravki warships waited for the old human vessel to stop. It did not stop. Gret fired a disabling shot at the Resolute's engine section. Or he tried to. The weapon his fleet used for disabling maneuvers was a focused ion burst, designed to overload the power distribution network of a target vessel and shut down its propulsion without causing structural damage. It was a precise tool. His weapons officer had used it 31 times in the past 12 days, and it had worked every single time because it was designed to work on the standard power architecture that all modern vessels used. The Resolute did not use standard power architecture. It used the architecture of 44 years ago, which distributed power differently, routed it through pathways that no longer appeared in any engineering manual because they had been considered inefficient by modern standards and phased out of use before most current ship designers were born. The ion burst hit the Resolute's aft section, interacted with a power grid it was not calibrated for, and produced an effect that Gret's weapons officer had never seen before. The shot did nothing. Not almost nothing. Nothing. The Resolute's engine output did not flicker. Its speed did not change. The targeting telemetry showed a clean hit on a live target and zero measurable effect. Gret's weapons officer reported this in the careful tone of a person who is not sure they are reading their instruments correctly. Gret told him to check the instruments. The instruments were correct. On the Resolute, Rafe Nkosi had felt the ion burst hit the hull. He knew what an ion burst felt like because he had been on the receiving end of one before, on a different ship, in a different corridor, under different circumstances. On that ship, it had worked. The engines had gone dark and the crew had spent 6 hours in emergency power waiting for someone to decide to rescue them. On the Resolute, it had felt like a door slamming somewhere in the lower decks. A thud, not even a big thud. He was in the secondary weapon bay, which was not listed on the Resolute's public registry as a weapon bay. It was listed as Auxiliary Storage Unit 4. This was because when Hara had pulled the secondary battery systems from a decommissioned ship and installed them in the Resolute, she had not seen any reason to update the registry in a way that would attract attention and questions. The secondary battery was old and it took time to warm up, and it fired ammunition rather than energy, which was unusual and inconvenient, and also meant that it was completely invisible to any scanner looking for weapon system signatures. Rafe was warming it up now. De La Obi was in the crawlspace above the main engine room. doing something to the ship's sensor output that would have required a long explanation to anyone who had not spent years learning the Resolute's particular logic. The short version was that she was making the ship look smaller than it was on Druvki passive scans. Not dramatically smaller, just enough smaller that the automatic targeting calibrations on Grut's weapons would be slightly off. Slightly off was sometimes enough. Grut had moved his fleet into a surrounding formation, while his weapons officer ran diagnostics trying to understand why the ion burst had not worked. 5 ships in a forward arc, 2 flanking, 2 positioned behind to cut off retreat. It was textbook containment. He broadcast a final warning to the Resolute informing the crew that noncompliance would result in escalating force. Hara acknowledged the transmission. She said she had received his message and that she wanted him to know her cargo was time-sensitive. She said the Yuthrani colony had already been waiting 2 months for clean water equipment. She said she was going to continue on her heading, and she hoped he would reconsider his position, but that she understood he had orders and she was not angry with him personally. Grut stared at this message for a moment. He had been in fleet command for 19 years. He had received a great many communications from vessels he was blocking. Some were pleading, some were argumentative, some were threatening in ways that did not hold up to the reality of the situation. He had never received one that was polite about the inconvenience while refusing to comply. He told his tactical officer to prepare a hull breach shot on the human vessel's forward cargo section, not to destroy the cargo, to breach the outer hull and force the crew to deal with an internal emergency, which would stop the ship more effectively than the ion burst had. His tactical officer prepared the shot. The Resolute was 700 meters away and closing, still on the same heading, still at the same speed. At 600 meters, something came out of the Resolute's lower hull. Not a weapon discharge, something physical. A small object, roughly cylindrical, tumbling slowly through space on a trajectory that would carry it nowhere near any of Grut's ships. His scan officer identified it as a detached hull panel from the human vessel's underside. 3 of Grut's ships automatically adjusted their positioning to avoid it, because floating debris near active weapon systems was a standard hazard protocol. When they adjusted, they created a brief gap in the containment formation on the Resolute's port side. The Resolute turned into that gap. It moved faster than Grut had expected from a ship of its age and condition. Not fast by modern standards, but fast enough that by the time his ships corrected their formation, the Resolute was no longer surrounded. It was alongside, parallel to his command ship, at a distance of 200 meters. Grut's weapons officer said that at 200 meters, the standard targeting systems had difficulty resolving firing solutions, because the ship was inside the minimum safe range for most of his primary weapons. Grut looked at the 200-meter gap between his command ship and the old human vessel. He understood in that moment that the hull panel had not fallen off. It had been thrown. And then the Resolute's secondary battery, which was not on any registry as a secondary battery, opened up, and Grut stopped thinking about hull panels and started thinking about very different things entirely. The secondary battery fired in short bursts. Not the long, sustained fire of a ship trying to destroy something. Short, precise bursts aimed at very specific points on Grut's command ship, points that Ruff had identified by spending the last 20 minutes studying the hull geometry on his scan screen and comparing it to an old tactical database that had been compiled during the First Contact War, when human analysts had spent a great deal of time learning exactly where Druvki ships were most vulnerable. That database was 44 years old. Druvki ships had changed since then. But not as much as people assumed. The fundamental engineering logic had stayed the same. The weak points had moved slightly. Ruff had accounted for the movement as best he could based on the visual scan data, and he had been right about 4 of the 6 points he targeted and close enough on the other 2 that it did not matter. The command ship's external communication array went dark. Then its forward sensor cluster. Then the maneuvering thruster on its port bow, which meant the ship could no longer turn left without using its main engine to compensate, which was slower and less precise. None of these hits destroyed anything. None of them were meant to. Ruff was not trying to destroy the command ship. He was trying to change what it could do. Grutt's bridge had become very loud. Officers were reporting damage and running diagnostics and talking over each other in the controlled panic of a crew that had been completely surprised. Grutt was trying to issue orders faster than the reports were coming in, which was difficult because the reports were coming in very fast. His communication officer told him that external comms to the rest of the fleet were down. His sensor officer told him that forward passive scan was offline. His navigation officer told him that the port thruster was unresponsive. Grutt grabbed the direct ship-to-ship channel and started issuing orders to his fleet manually, reading out coordinates and instructions the way commanders had done before modern communication systems existed. Because the Druvki military still trained for communication blackouts, even though it had been a long time since anyone had actually experienced one. His fleet responded. They were good crews. They began tightening formation around the command ship to protect it, which was the correct response to a command ship under attack. It was also exactly what Hara had expected them to do. The Resolute pulled away from the command ship and moved toward the two flanking vessels that had been positioned on the port and starboard sides of the formation. They were repositioning now, moving to close in behind the command ship, and that movement was taking them briefly out of their ideal positions. Pulla had been watching their movement patterns for the last several minutes and had already calculated the window. The window was 11 seconds. In those 11 seconds, the Resolute moved through the gap between the two flanking ships at a distance that made Grutt's weapons officers uncomfortable. Because when a vessel was that close, you could not fire heavy weapons without risk of hitting your own ships, and the lighter weapons were not effective against the Resolute's outer plating at that angle. As it passed, the Resolute did something that took Grutt several seconds to understand. It broadcast something, not a weapon, a signal, a very specific signal on a very specific frequency. The frequency was one that Druvki ships used for internal damage control coordination, a frequency that automatically triggered certain automated safety protocols when it detected specific damage signatures in the broadcast. The signal Ruff broadcast was not a real damage signature. It was a constructed one, built from the first contact war database, and it told the automated safety systems of both flanking ships that they had experienced a critical power surge in their engine cores, and that emergency shutdown protocols were initiating. Modern ships had these protocols because modern ships had nearly destroyed themselves with power surges twice in the 30 years since the war, and the automated shutdown had been built in as a safeguard. It was a good safeguard. It was also a safeguard that assumed the signal telling it to shut down was coming from inside the ship. It had no way to know the signal was coming from outside. Both flanking ships shut their engines down simultaneously. They did not lose power entirely. Emergency systems stayed active. Lights stayed on. Life support stayed on. But propulsion and weapons went into lockdown and would not come back online until a manual override was entered by a senior officer on each ship, which required those officers to reach their engineering sections and physically interface with the shutdown systems, which took time. It took, on average, between 8 and 12 minutes. Grutt watched two of his ships go dark and silent on either side of his command ship, and experienced a feeling he had not felt in 19 years of fleet command. He did not have a word for it in his current mental state. Later, he would call it the feeling of realizing that the rules of the situation were not the rules he had been playing by. The Resolute was already past the flanking ships and moving toward the forward arc, where 5 of his remaining vessels were positioned. Those crews had seen what had just happened to the flanking ships, and they had no idea how it had happened, which meant they did not know how to prevent it from happening to them. Gret got a partial message out through one of his backup communication channels before it also went offline. The message told his forward arc commanders to change their internal damage control frequencies immediately and to not accept any external broadcast on their emergency channels. 2 of the 5 forward ships received the message in time. 3 did not. 3 more ships went dark. Gret had started with 9. He now had 4 that were fully functional, 2 that were in emergency shutdown working on manual overrides, and 3 that were offline and drifting. His command ship was missing its forward sensors, its external communication array, and its port bow thruster. He was still the senior commander of the Dravki Territorial Authority's blockade of the Varen Passage. He still had 4 functional warships. By the numbers, he still had an advantage. The numbers had stopped feeling like an advantage some time ago. He switched to a backup communication system that ran through a different hardware pathway and reached one of his 2 functional forward ships, a vessel commanded by an officer named Pell, who was one of the better tactical minds in the fleet. He told Pell to take command of the remaining functional ships and execute a standard pincer closure on the human vessel, moving in from 4 sides simultaneously so that it could not use proximity to prevent weapons fire. Pell acknowledged and began coordinating. On the Resolute, Cass picked up the new communication frequency almost immediately. She was 19 years old and had grown up on a communications relay station and had spent her childhood listening to signals the way other children listen to music, finding patterns in them, understanding their structure intuitively. She had been monitoring Gret's fleet communications since the engagement began, not to intercept the content, which was encrypted, but to track the patterns. Which ships were talking to which, how often, for how long. When Gret switched to the backup system, the pattern changed. Cass saw the change and understood what it meant before she could have explained exactly how she understood it. She told Hara that the fleet was reorganizing, that the traffic was routing through a different source now, and that the 4 remaining functional ships were starting to move in a coordinated pattern. Hara asked if she could identify the coordinating ship. Cass tracked the signal traffic for 40 seconds. She said it was coming from the second ship in the forward arc on the starboard side. Hara looked at the scan display. The coordinating ship was not Gret's command vessel. It was a different ship, one that had received Gret's warning message in time and changed its emergency frequencies before the Resolute could shut it down. It was the most dangerous ship left in the fleet now because it was thinking clearly while the others were still reacting. She told Rafe to take its engines. Rafe said he could try, but the angle was bad. The ship was behind 2 others, and he did not have a clean shot at the engine housing without risk of hitting one of the ships between them. Hara said to take a different engine. She told him to look at the maneuvering array rather than the main drive. Rafe looked. The maneuvering array on a Dravki warship was a series of smaller thrusters distributed around the hull for fine positioning. They were individually small targets, but if you removed enough of them from the correct side of the ship, the vessel could not maintain a coordinated position in a formation, because it would constantly drift in one direction and have to compensate with its main engine, which pulled its attention away from targeting. Rafe said that would take a lot of shots. Hara said they had a lot of shots. The secondary battery opened up again, not at the engine housing, at the small thruster clusters on the starboard side of the coordinating ship, picking them off one by one. The ship's automated repair systems flagged each one as minor damage and kept functioning. Pell, the officer commanding it, did not initially understand what was being targeted or why. He kept coordinating the pincer maneuver. His 4 ships moved. But his ship started to drift. Slowly, barely perceptibly at first, but the drift accumulated, and correcting it required him to burn his main engine in short bursts, and those bursts disrupted the smooth coordination he was trying to maintain with the other three ships, and the gaps in the pincer that should have closed started opening and closing unevenly instead. The Resolute moved through the gaps. It did not move through them fast. It moved through them methodically, the way water finds the low points in a landscape, always going where the resistance was least. Pella had a gift for reading formation movement that Hara had recognized when she hired her and had been grateful for ever since. Pella watched the four ships trying to close and saw the moments before they happened when a gap would appear, and she moved the Resolute into those moments with a calm precision that looked from outside like something between confidence and indifference. Gret, watching from his damaged command ship, was trying to understand what he was seeing. He had been in fleet engagements before. He understood fleet tactics. The human ship was not doing anything that appeared in his tactical training. It was not trying to break through the formation or destroy its way to safety. It was moving through the formation the way you move through a crowd of people, finding the spaces between bodies, never pushing, just going where there was room to go. His ships kept almost closing on it. They kept almost having it trapped. And then the space would shift slightly and it would be somewhere slightly different. He sent a message to Pell telling him to stop trying to close, and instead to simply hold position and force the human ship to come to them. Pell received the message. He did not get a chance to implement it. Because while Gret had been focused on the four functional ships and the human vessel moving between them, he had not been paying close attention to the two ships in emergency shutdown that were working on their manual overrides. He had assumed they were out of the engagement. He had been correct about this. They were out of the engagement. What he had not considered was that the Resolute had not forgotten about them. While the maneuvering battle with Pell's four ships had been happening, Dela had been doing something in the Resolute's forward section that required 3 separate tools and a great deal of patience. She had been working on the ship's old grapple system, which was a heavy-duty magnetic tether mechanism that had originally been used for capturing debris in post-battle salvage operations during the war. It had not been used in 9 years. It worked. The grapple fired from the Resolute's forward section, crossed 200 meters of space, and attached itself to the hull of the nearest shutdown ship, with a clang that Gret's command ship sensors picked up as an anomalous contact. By the time anyone understood what the anomalous contact was, the Resolute had begun pulling the shutdown ship, slowly, into the path of 2 of Pell's functional warships. The functional ships had to stop advancing to avoid a collision with a vessel that held their own crew members. The pincer stopped closing. The Resolute went through the gap. On the other side of Gret's fleet, clear space opened ahead of it, and beyond that, the rest of the Varen Passage, and beyond that, a Ythrani colony waiting on clean water. Gret realized he had no move left that did not risk killing his own people. Gret opened the channel. He had to use a tertiary system because 2 of his primary communication pathways were offline. His voice came through with a slight distortion that he could not fix from where he was sitting. He identified himself and said that he was requesting a temporary halt to hostilities for the purpose of recovering his disabled vessels. The response came back in less than 30 seconds. Hara said that was fine and asked if any of his crew members on the disabled ships needed medical assistance. Gret told his medical officer to check the status reports from the ships in emergency shutdown. His medical officer confirmed that the shutdowns had been clean and there were no injuries. He told Hara that his crews were unharmed. She said she was glad to hear it. He sat with that for a moment, not the words themselves, the tone. He had been in communications with a great many enemy vessels over the years, and the tone of someone who had just tactically dismantled most of your fleet and was asking about your crew's health with what appeared to be genuine concern was not a tone he had encountered before. He asked his intelligence officer, a careful woman named Sova, to pull everything available on the human vessel and its crew. Sova had already been doing this for the last 40 minutes. She laid the results in front of him methodically. The UHS Resolute had been built 44 years ago at a human construction facility that no longer existed. It had served in the First Contact War under a different crew and a different name, the original name having been changed at some point during its private ownership history for reasons the records did not explain. It had been sold at salvage auction 9 years ago and registered to Hara Osai, listed occupation, independent cargo carrier. In 9 years of operation under its current owner, it had completed 67 cargo runs. Sova had been able to verify the nature of 41 of those runs through trade records and manifest filings. Of those 41, 34 had been humanitarian or critical supply contracts, medical equipment, water systems, emergency food stocks, sheltering materials for disaster-affected settlements. One run had been a straight commercial cargo contract for a manufacturing company. The remaining 6 were listed as general freight without further detail. The ship had never been cited for any violation in any jurisdiction it had operated in. It had 2 commendations on file, one from a Yithrani settlement authority and one from a human colonial administration, both for service above and beyond contract terms. Gret read this and then read it again. He asked Sova if there was anything in the record that suggested the ship, or its crew, had ever sought out confrontation. Sova said no. She said the engagement record showed that the Resolute had been boarded twice by hostile parties and had defended itself on both occasions, but there was no record of it ever initiating force against any vessel. Gret thought about the way the engagement had gone. The human captain had not tried to destroy his ships. She had disabled his communications so he could not coordinate. She had shut down his engines through a technical trick he had not known was possible. She had used his own ships as obstacles. At no point had she fired on a crew compartment or targeted anything that would cause casualties. She had fought like someone who wanted to get past him, not someone who wanted to hurt him. He asked Sova what the cargo manifest on the current run listed. Sova said 43 crates of water filtration equipment, bound for the Yithrani colony on the far side of the passage. He asked if the Yithrani colony's water situation had been independently verified. Sova checked. She came back with a report from the Galactic Council's Humanitarian Monitoring Office, confirming that the colony had been operating on compromised water supply for 63 days and had submitted 3 formal requests for assistance, none of which had been fulfilled yet. 63 days. He thought about the human captain's voice when she had told him her cargo was time-sensitive. He thought about the way she had said it, not angrily, not as a tactic, just as information offered to a person she seemed to genuinely believe might care. He had not cared at the time. He sat quietly for a moment in his damaged command ship, with his disabled fleet scattered around him, and thought about what he had been doing in this passage for 12 days. His orders were to establish territorial authority presence in the Varen corridor and enforce the reclassification designation pending a full council review. He had been following those orders. He had turned back 31 vessels without incident, and the council review was ongoing, and there was a reasonable legal argument that the territorial authority had the right to do what it was doing. There was also a 63-day-old water crisis on the other side of the passage, and a woman who had just dismantled most of his fleet rather than turn around and let it keep going. He looked at the scan display. The Resolute was holding position 300 meters past the edge of his formation. It was not running, it was waiting. He clicked the channel open again and asked Hara why she had not kept going when she had the chance. The response was a few seconds in coming. She said she wanted to make sure he could recover his ship safely before she cleared the area. She said if his tow systems were damaged, she could offer the Resolute's grapple assist once she released the ship she currently had on the tether. Gret looked at the grapple tether, still connecting the Resolute to his disabled vessel on his scan display. He asked if she was offering to help tow his ships, using the same grapple she had used to disable his formation. She said yes. She said it was a good grapple. Something happened in Gret's chest that he could not immediately classify. It was not quite amusement. It was not quite shame. It was somewhere in between, in a place he did not often visit. He told her that his tow systems were functional, and that he would manage the recovery without assistance, but that he appreciated the offer. She said any time. He closed the channel and sat for a moment. Then he opened a direct line to his superior at Territorial Authority Command and requested an urgent review of the humanitarian exemption enforcement policy. He did not frame it as a complaint. He did not mention the engagement in detail. He said only that he had encountered a situation in the field that suggested the current policy had practical complications that had not been anticipated. His superior said they would review it. Gret said he recommended they review it soon. He watched the scan display as the Resolute released the tethered ship and began moving again, slowly on its original heading, through the passage, toward the far side. It did not look like a warship when it moved like that. It looked like what it was. A cargo carrier going somewhere it needed to go, carrying something someone needed to have, bothering no one who did not get in its way. He watched it until it cleared his scan range. Then he started the work of putting his fleet back together. The Ythrani colony did not look like much from orbit. It was a small settlement pressed against the base of a mineral shelf on a moon that had been deemed marginally habitable 30 years ago and had never been upgraded past marginally. The structures were low and practical, and showed the particular architectural style of people who had been building things themselves for a long time without access to professional construction equipment. There were gardens on the south side that looked carefully maintained. There was a landing area that had clearly been expanded by hand at some point, the edges uneven where someone had worked the ground with tools rather than machines. 412 people lived there. The colony administrator who met the Resolute at the landing area was not what Hara had expected, though she had not expected anything specific. He was an older man named Barrow, heavyset and slow-moving, with the kind of calm that comes from spending decades managing problems that do not resolve quickly. He shook Hara's hand with both of his and did not say thank you immediately, which she respected. He waited until his people had started unloading the cargo, and he had confirmed with his water systems engineer that the equipment was what they needed and was intact, and then he said it. He said they had been told 3 times over 63 days that supplies were coming. He said he had stopped telling his people to expect them. He said he had started thinking about what they would do if nothing came. Hara asked what they would have done. He said honestly he was not sure. The contamination was slow. It would not have killed anyone quickly, but long-term exposure to the compound levels they were dealing with caused neurological effects over years, and they had children on the settlement, and the children were the reason he had stopped sleeping well. Hara said she understood. He asked if she had had any trouble getting through the passage. She said there had been a navigational complication that had been resolved. He looked at the Resolute, which was visible through the settlement's exterior windows, sitting on the landing area with a slight list to starboard that was new since the engagement and which Delau was already investigating. He looked at it for a few seconds and then looked back at Hara and did not ask any more questions about the navigational complication. He asked if her crew needed anything, food, rest, any supplies he could offer. She said they were fine, but that they would stay until the filtration equipment was fully installed and tested if he wanted an extra set of hands. He said he would very much want that. They stayed 2 days. Rafe helped with the physical installation because he was good with mechanical systems, and because the filtration units were heavy and the colony's crew was tired. Cass spent most of the first day in the settlement's communications center, not because anyone asked her to, but because she noticed their long-range communication system had a calibration issue that was reducing its effective range by about 30%, and she fixed it without mentioning it to anyone until she was done. Pella helped with mapping the settlement's water distribution lines, so the new system could be integrated correctly. Delad did not come off the ship. She was under it, around it, inside it, doing things to the starboard stabilizer that had been developing a problem for 3 months and had gotten worse during the engagement. She worked through both nights. On the morning of the second day, she came into the settlement's small common room for food and sat at a table and fell asleep at it, which nobody disturbed for 2 hours. On the afternoon of the second day, the filtration system ran its first clean cycle. The colony's water engineer checked the output readings 3 times before she said anything. Then she said the numbers were good. Then she said them again. Then she sat down on the floor of the filtration room and put her hands over her face and stayed like that for a while. Nobody said anything. Some things did not need commentary. The Resolute left the next morning. Barrow was at the landing area again, and this time there were more people with him. Not a crowd exactly, just people who had come out in the morning cold to stand near the ship while it prepared to leave. Some of them had children with them. The children looked at the Resolute with the frank curiosity of people who had never seen a ship that looked quite like it. One small girl asked her father why the ship was so old. He said he did not know. She asked if it was going to fall apart. He said he did not think so. She thought about this, and then said that old things that had not fallen apart yet were probably not going to. Barrow, standing nearby, heard this and looked at the ship for a moment and said quietly that in his experience the girl was right. The Resolute lifted on its main drive with the sound it always made, which was loud and particular, and nothing like any modern ship's engine note. It cleared the settlement's landing zone and began climbing, and the people on the ground watched it go until it was too small to see. In the Galactic Council chambers, 9 days later, Gret's report arrived alongside 3 other reports from vessels that had been turned back at the Varen Passage blockade. The Council's review committee had already been moving slowly on the territorial authority reclassification question and had been expected to continue moving slowly for another few months. Gret's report changed the pace of things. He had written it carefully. He had not exaggerated, and he had not minimized. He had described what had happened in the technical language of a fleet engagement report, and the technical language made clear exactly how one old private cargo carrier with a crew of 26 had neutralized 9 territorial authority warships without causing a single fatality on either side, while carrying humanitarian cargo to a settlement that needed it. The review committee read the report in a single session. The humanitarian exemption was reinstated in the Varen corridor within 48 hours. The reclassification provision was referred for a comprehensive legal review that most observers expected to take a long time, though some expected it to take less time than usual. The Resolute was 2 days into its return journey and did not know about any of this because Hara did not follow council proceedings as a rule. She found them slow, and she had cargo to move. There was a new contract waiting at Mevari Station, a consignment of seed stock for an agricultural settlement that had lost most of its planting material to a blight, and she had said she could have it there in 10 days if the route was clear. She intended to have it there in 8. The Resolute flew on through empty space, its engine making its usual sound, its running lights steady, its crew going about the small practical work of keeping a 44-year-old ship doing what it had always done. Somewhere in the dark behind it, the Varen Passage was open again. It would stay open.